Welcome to Standing for Truth. My name is Donny Budinsky, and I am privileged to be your host for tonight's powerful presentation. We are honored to be joined by creation speaker and author Bruce Malone for a talk you will not forget, The Awe of God. Why are so many young people losing their sense of wonder, purpose, and belief in a creator? Bruce argues it's because the awe of God has been trained out of them by a secular, evolution-driven culture. And tonight, he's here to help restore it. Get ready to see mind-blowing features in creatures, designs, instincts, and systems so intricate that evolution cannot begin to explain them. From biological engineering to scientific impossibilities, Bruce will show exactly why creation shouts the genius of God and why understanding design is essential for the next generation. If you care about creation, science, apologetics, or strengthening faith, you won't want to miss what's coming. Let's dive into the awe of God with Bruce Malone. Bruce, it's a pleasure to have you. How are you doing today?
Thank you, Donnie. It's not just an honor, it's a privilege to be on your show and speaking to so many folks online. I'm doing good, getting ready for Christmas. I had my last major speaking event in Washington last week with 10 talks over 4 days.
Wow.
And now I'm ready for Christmas stuff. This session is actually my last scheduled event of the year. So you get to cap off 2025.
Wow. Well, I appreciate that. That's an honor, Bruce. And you've been busy, so I appreciate you giving us your last speaking engagement for the year. You said 10 talks in 4 days in
Yeah,
Washington. Wow.
that's typical when I have a creation group or a group of Christians coming in, bring me in. They'll set up a lot of Christian schools, evening sessions, churches, etc. Unfortunately, I'm locked out of any public education chances here in the U.S. But just as a point of interest for your viewers and listeners, that is very unique to the Western world, Europe and America. In the rest of the developing world, there's not this antagonism to try to keep God completely removed from the education system of the kids. So I'm able to go into public high schools in multiple nations. We've been to 6 nations so far. Next year, we'll do Kenya, Rwanda, and El Salvador. And we can do an hour-long science assembly where we talk about geology, biology, genetics, physics, cosmology, and show them what science shows us about where things came from. And that's the kind of things we're going to talk about tonight.
Wow, praise the Lord, Bruce. I cannot wait to see your presentation. I know the audience is going to love it as well. And so before we hand it to you, though, for your talk here, I do want to give you a brief introduction for anybody who might be unfamiliar with who you are. And so Bruce Malone is a creation speaker, author, and former Dow chemical research leader with 17 patents to his name. After giving his life to Christ over 40 years ago, he left a successful engineering career to serve full-time as director for Search for the Truth Ministries, Standing for Truth Ministries, very close,
Nice.
sharing clear and engaging evidence for biblical creation. You've given so many good talks, Bruce, so I'm really excited for this one. Bruce has delivered over 1,500 talks to more than 170,000 people worldwide and has authored or co-authored 8 creation books with hundreds of thousands of copies donated to students and prisoners. Known for making science come alive through stories and demonstrations, Bruce equips Christians to understand and defend the truth of creation. Well, I really appreciate all the work that you've done over the years, Bruce. You've certainly been a blessing, and I think we're ready to get into your presentation.
Before I jump into the slides, just a little background for your viewers. I came out of a university with a degree in chemical engineering, basically agnostic. I had been trained to think in a certain way, as is essentially 95% of every student who goes through the public education system. God is 100% left out. Now, that only goes back to 1949, a Supreme Court decision to have a separation of church and state. The state runs the school. God has to do with the church. So by law, he's essentially forced out, as is the Bible and prayer. So students are only led in one possible direction. Now, as a scientist, as we start to talk about cosmology, where did everything come from? Cosmic evolution, chemical evolution. Could life have made itself? Biological evolution. Has a bacteria turned into a human being just by random mutational chances over eons of time? There are enormous problems with these, and science cannot go in a laboratory or go back in time and prove what has happened. So the belief in creation is absolutely 100% faith, but so is the belief in cosmic, chemical, biological evolution, because you can't prove it in a laboratory. You can only do experiments to show that things modify, things adapt, things change. But does that prove a bacteria can change into a fish? So what we're going to look at is, what does science actually show us, and how does it work, and how do we determine the truth? Now, I'm going to approach that from a different angle as I do one of the presentations I do frequently as I go into universities, churches, whatever. And it honestly starts for the first 10, 15 minutes dealing from a biblical viewpoint about where things came from. And I have no apology for that. I think it's important, even if you're skeptical, even if your belief is atheism, that God doesn't even exist, even if you don't really think God is relevant, to understand why those of us who say the Bible is authoritative, it's accurate, it's trustworthy, and that God exists, why we believe what we do. Because it's not a blind faith. And God tells us that we are to have a reason for the belief that's within us. Jesus said we're to love the Lord our God with all of our heart, strength, and mind and soul. The mind is never left out. So that's, I think, the whole purpose of this searching for truth and defending the truth. And thank you, Donny, for what you're doing. So with that, we're going to talk about why is there an increasing skepticism, disinterest, and even antagonism toward a biblical God who has literally done supernatural acts in the past? Because that's not always been the case. The founders of modern science, and I'm talking about Isaac Newton and Michael Faraday and Louis Pasteur and James Maxwell and Lord Kelvin, dozens of the people who literally developed modern science, they all believed that God existed, the Bible was accurate and reliable, and that the things were recently created. And it didn't stop any of them from developing modern science. So this is not a faith versus science issue. This is a which faith is actually true. And I believe by using science, we can actually determine that in a very specific way. So what happens? Why are so many people skeptical of the Bible, skeptical of creation, skeptical of God? And I've kind of boiled it down to the one thing Donny mentioned. It's trained out of us. When God is left out of our thinking for 20 years of education, and the entire education, media, museum system leaves it out, our brain literally starts to just think in that way and fit whatever evidence comes in into the framework of truth that is developed. But there's even a more important thing going on. And why would we lose this awe that a small child has for God? I mean, it is almost instantly acknowledged by any young child that there's something behind the beauty and the complexity and the organization and the phenomenal things we see in nature. They just know there's a God that exists. But by the time, like myself, I'm 21, it's like, God doesn't even exist. He's irrelevant. Well, life beats us up. That's the second thing that's going on. And that is kind of the starting point of Christianity. It doesn't start with Jesus Christ. It starts with, why did he have to die? Why does death exist? Why do problems exist? Why does cancer exist? Why does the universe operate the way it does? And the Bible gives us a very clear supernatural answer, because mankind was given the freedom when he was created in God's image, therefore with freedom of choice, to either obey God or not, God chose to spit in God's face and say, I don't want you to be in charge. I want to be in charge. I don't want you to be God. I want to be my own God. And essentially, every human being has done that since. Well, God is holy. He's just. You could never trust or honor or want to be associated with a judge who is totally corrupt and totally unjust. And sin, knowing where it will lead, has to be judged. And God's judgment is death. And therefore he changed all of creation. Death is here not because God made it that way, not because there's been millions and billions of years of death, but because we, in a real event that really happened in real time, in real history here on planet Earth, basically made ourselves God. And God said, no, I know where that's leading. It is only going to lead to slavery, hatred, wars, problems, human sacrifice, sexual immorality, child abuse. Name the problem, it deals with human sin and us making our own selves the one who makes the rules. So God brought death into creation, which means all of us are going to have problems. So life beats us up. We are going to have financial problems. We're going to have health problems. We're going to have relationship problems. We're going to have work-related problems. There's going to be wars. There's going to be things that happen, and we lose the awe of who God is. So what do we do about that with the people around us? First of all, we have to help them understand why it all is the way it is. It's our fault, not God's fault. And it's a reality of history. Second, I'm going to take us for the first 15 minutes and walk us through the one book in the Bible that deals more than any other book with this issue of death and problems and despair and pain. And that's the book of Job. Now, let me pull up our PowerPoint slides, and I'm going to move forward from there. And then we're going to move into looking at some of these creatures God has made for a very specific region. So if we're losing our awe of God because it's trained out of young children to the point God's irrelevant, and we're living in a world filled with pain, and if God exists and he's all powerful, then why would he allow such a world filled with pain and death? And that's the way people think, because they don't realize we brought it into creation. And without it, we would live forever and be forever separated from God.
Bruce?
Yes.
Excellent introduction, brother. I wanted to ask if you thought it might be best at the bottom there. There's a little bar that you could click hide on, just in case it blocks any of your text.
Okay, hide the bar. Where do I click on that?
I think it says hide right at the far right next to stop sharing. So make sure you don't click.
Yes, thanks. Yep, got it.
Okay, you're good to go, Bruce.
So let's start by acknowledging what the Bible says. And now this might not be for agnostics, as I was in the past, or atheists, but for those who are Christians or interested in Christianity, you have to realize what God says about this whole issue of creation. And this is from the book of Romans. It says, that which may be known about God is obvious to them. Now, in context, that means every single human being who has ever lived. What may be known about God is obvious to every human being, for God has shown it to every human being. The invisible things of God from the creation of the world are clearly seen by what has been made. We can even understand God's power and his nature by looking at what he has made. So people are without excuse for belief in God. Why? Not because he doesn't exist, not because he's hiding himself, but because we can look at what he's made. We can literally use science, which is a tool to understand how creation operates, to know, absolutely know, it couldn't have made itself. You see, if you think, and I'm going to hide this for a second. If you think, am I back on screen perchance, or do we need to hide something else?
We can put you full screen.
Okay.
There we go.
If you think of the whole universe as this box, okay, like all the time, space, energy, matter, everything, all the galaxies, star, it's a jewelry box. And let's say the jewels represent inside, they represent the life and all the complexity and beauty of the life itself. Either the box and everything in it made itself, or something outside the box made the box and the things in it. Now, if you say God just used evolution, evolution's saying the box made itself, life made itself, bacteria turned into human beings. Lots of Christians will say, well, God maybe just he used evolution. Well, that's still saying the box made itself. If that's true, there is no evidence from studying the box and using science that God exists, because all the evidence points to the box having made itself. So you can't have it both ways. You can't believe what the Bible says. By studying creation, we can know God exists and that he made things, and believe in evolution. They're mutually exclusive. Either one is true and the other's wrong, or the other's wrong and the other one's true. So let's just, kind of start right there and now return to this issue of why do people lose their awe that God is creator, and then look at the creatures he's made and how it points us to knowing he made them. Now, with that, let's look at Job, because Job is considered the oldest book in the Bible. The people in it lived for hundreds of years before lifetimes had dropped off because of genetic mutations building up generation after generation. It contains incredible scientific insights, like saying the earth floats upon nothing. Now, for almost 4,000 years after that was written, everybody had no idea. And now we found out it's absolutely scientifically accurate. But more importantly, it addresses this issue of pain and suffering and gives this ultimate solution and hope when we're in the midst of it. Now, for those who aren't familiar with the Bible, let me just walk you through it in about a 2 or 3 minute overcapping of what's going on. In this book, God points out Job as the most righteous man on earth. And Satan says, of course he does. You blessed him with all this stuff. He's incredibly rich. So God says, gives the freedom to test him. Job was selected by God to allow to go through incredible hardship. Now, Job is described as having 10 children, 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, oxen, donkeys, a huge household. In essence, he had a private army, the greatest man of the East. Consider the richest trillionaire you can imagine. That was Job. Now, Job, in an instant, lost all 10 children of a natural disaster. Now, God he can change things because he's outside of the box and he is all powerful. If something is happening, he is allowing it to happen. And because he's outside of the box, he's outside of time. Time is part of the physical universe. So he knows everything that's ever going to happen. So if it's happening, he's allowing it. First of all, Christians need to get that straight. And those who don't even understand Christianity need to understand that is what the Bible teaches and very strongly shows. So God is allowing this, and he's losing all 10 children. Now, that is unbelievable emotional torment. Next, Job loses everything in another natural disaster. All of his flocks, all of his animals, all of his helpers, all of his servants, everything is wiped out. He goes from being a trillionaire to penniless in an instant. Third, Job loses his health. He has, I think, one of the worst imaginable medical conditions because it's physically all over his body, called boils from the top of his head to the soles of his feet, itching, intolerable, pussy, oozing, fluid-filled boils where the only relief is to scrape them with broken pottery. So the pain of being scraped bloody is worse than the pain of the boils. So simultaneously, he has intolerable emotional, financial, and physical pain going on. And he has no idea why any of it's happening. And he served the Lord to all his ability for his entire life. Now, I think this man suffered in a short period of time more than almost any other human being has ever suffered, because it was all simultaneous. And here's his response to it. Naked I came out of my mother's womb, naked I shall return. The Lord gave, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. This man did not lose his awe of God in the midst of unbelievable pain and suffering in a fallen world, which we brought it onto ourselves. None of us deserve anything from God. We've spit in his face and said, I want to be God. I don't want you to be God. And I think if you were to ask Billy Graham and Mother Teresa, they would say, put us at the top of that list, because they know when we stand face to face with who God really is in his majesty and holiness, we are like filthy rags in our best attempt at righteousness. And in all this, Job sinned nor charged God foolishly. Now, for the next 32 chapters, friends come and try to convince God if he would just work harder and be better and pray more and be a more perfect person, none of this would have happened to him. And in essence, that is the lie of religion. If we just pray enough or follow this set of rules or do really good or work really hard, we'll end up in heaven with God. The Bible from cover to cover denies that. Jesus, time after time after time, said there's no way back to the Father except through me. It is only through his taking the penalty of death upon himself and acknowledging that in faith and acknowledging our own sinfulness that we'll ever come back into fellowship with God. We can never be good enough. We can never work enough. So the greatest test of Job was the sin to have the wrong belief system, to accept a lie that we can make ourselves good enough to live with God forever. Christianity is different than any other religion. Every other religion on earth is a man-made attempt to become good enough to live for eternity with God. Christianity says you'll never be good enough. You have to accept and believe what I have done for you. It is a free gift. So just that background. Now we come to the longest monologue in the entire Bible of the creator of the universe. For 3 solid chapters, God, when Job has cried out, why am I suffering? Why is there pain? I wish I'd never been born. I'm in so much agony. God never answers that question. He simply talks about what he has created, starting with the creation of the universe, starting with the creation of constellations and stars, then moving to the earth, and then moving to animals, and then moving to the largest, most magnificent animals that he's ever created, which is a very accurate description of dinosaurs, which Job must have known about. Therefore, they must have come through the worldwide flood and lived at the time of Job. Now, in the middle of it all, again, Job says, I know that my Redeemer lives, that he shall in the latter days stand upon the earth. See, while being tempted to say, I can be my own Redeemer, I can just be good enough to make all this pain go away, to make this world more perfect, Job acknowledged, I know that's not true. God has promised there will become someone here on earth who will redeem us from our pain, who will take the penalty that we deserve, someone who redeems, who makes things the way they should be. In that, it's a person who will come and stand up on the earth in the latter days. That would be Jesus, who came about 4,000 years after the initial creation. So, God's first question to Job was, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? That sounds like a supernatural creation to me, not some slow, gradual, natural process. Declare if you have understanding. See, God is pointing out to Job, we are stuck in time. We have the limitations of intellect, the limitations of where we can be, the limitations of what we can know, the limitations that science can take us back and forth in time. But God has none of those limitations. And then he starts to show Job about creation. Now, at the end of it all, this is Job's response. He says he knows God's character. He's heard it all the way from Adam and Eve to their sons, to Noah, to the information and knowledge Noah brought through the flood, to the people who lived after the flood, down to Job, God's very characteristics. Job says, I know that you, God, can do anything, and even our thoughts you know. He says, I've heard of you with my ear, but now my eyes have seen you. And by the way, the response throughout the Bible when someone comes face to face with who God really is to understand their own sinfulness and to just repent, almost just naturally, almost irresistibly. But what did he mean, my eyes have seen you? Last little bit of teaching before we kind of recap Job and then move on to this 3-chapter monologue of God where he's just talking about what he's made. And that would, the things that are important in Scripture, God makes them crystal clear. I mean, there are religious denominations across the world and throughout time that are going to argue about all sorts of stuff because we're never going to understand everything in the Bible because it's his very mind being revealed to us. We're never going to totally comprehend everything it says. But what's important, he makes super clear, and he repeats it over and over, and it shows up in both the Old Testament and New Testament. So here in the Old Testament, it says, by looking at creation, you're actually seeing me. Notice that first verse I started with. Now we're in the New Testament. What would be known about God is obvious to everybody because he's shown it to them, because what we can know about God is clearly seen and understood by what he has made, and we'll know his power and nature. Same concept, same statement, New and Old Testament. By looking at creation, we can know all about God, that he exists in his very nature. So in the end, at the end of this phenomenal book of the Bible, God blesses Job for not giving into despair and not giving into denying who he was, but not giving into the knowledge that there was a Redeemer coming. And that's who will bring us back into salvation. God blessed Job by giving him twice as many of all the different animals and then 10 more sons and daughters. Now, even the little things in Scripture are incredibly revealing and unique. Why would God give Job twice as much of all his possessions and not give him twice as many children? It's because of a very important biblical and actually truth. It's not just a spiritual truth, it's a truth. When we die, we're not gone. When we die, our spirit and our soul does not cease to exist. Our physical body has paid the penalty for our sin. But who we are, the essence of our existence, our soul and our spirit, is either going to live for eternity with God or it's going to live for eternity separated from God because we've refused to accept what he's done to bring us back into salvation and fellowship with him. And that's to take the penalty upon himself. So if God had given Job 20 children, it'd be like saying those first 10 no longer even exist. Job was given 20 children. The first 10 are just now dead. They've stepped through a door into a different spiritual reality, but it's still reality. We just can no longer see it. So here's those lessons from Job. Pain and suffering are not caused by God, but they're allowed by God because of our actions. Trusting God during times of suffering will be rewarded. If not on this life, then in the life to come. Job reminds us that this life is not all there is, and we're not just gone when we die. And last, it does hurt in this life. Our loved ones die, children die. We have incredible pain. We have psychological issues and physical issues and mental issues and relationship issues. And by the way, we bring many of them on ourselves. But in the midst of those, focusing on God, which we can't see, but we can see what he's made so we can know he exists, is like that anchor that will get us through it. But if everything just made itself, we have no assurance God even exists. So this topic is really, really important to giving us an anchor in this fallen, beaten up world that we live in. So with that, let's just look for a second, starting with the simplest life of the idea that it could have made itself. The simplest cell is more complex than the most complicated machine mankind has ever produced. Now, nobody looks at a machine and thinks, oh, it just made itself. We know it had an intelligence behind it. The parts are all specifically designed in a specific shape. Now, the same is true of a cell. It's made of thousands of parts, and not one of those parts could ever have made itself. Now, this is why every part in every bacteria or every cell in life has to make copies of itself or it's dead in one generation. Machines don't do that. Machines don't just make copies, physical, hard hard parts, copies of themselves. They have to bring parts in from somewhere else, even if it's a robot that could then assemble the parts. They can't just make a copy of themselves. But a cell can do that. It can just start with raw materials produced inside the cell and make another copy of itself. But every part has to have an exact, perfect, three-dimensional shape, or it doesn't work as part of the biological machine. Now, the simplest chemical that forms a part inside of a cell is called a protein. It's the most common chemical of life. And a protein is made by lining up like 20 smaller parts called amino acids. Now, I could spend an hour just talking about this, and we have lots of animals we want to look at. So I'm going to simplify it probably more than I should. But these amino acids in all of life, all of the proteins of all of life that forms the perfect shaped parts that form the cells, that form the structures, that form the bodies of different animals, they're lined up like little Lego blocks. Now imagine you only have 20 different shaped Lego blocks. Little flat ones and little thicker ones, and some with 8 little knobs and some with 2 little knobs and a couple that look like wheels or whatever, but there's only 20 different shapes. By following a set of intelligently designed instructions, you can put those 20 shapes together and you might end up with something that looks like a house. You don't have lots of copies of the 20 shapes, but only 20 different shapes. You could put them together different. It might look like a car. Put them together a different way. It might look like an airplane. Put them together different, look like a road. Put them together in a completely different way. It might look like a chair. Now the chair or the road or the little automobile or the plane, those represent a protein molecule. The parts, the amino acids, have to be placed in exactly the right position or you won't get the final correct shape. Now, I think everybody inherently knows if you had a pile of 10,000 Lego blocks and there's just 20 different shapes, and you put on a blindfold and you put on a pair of gloves so you couldn't even know which shape you're grabbing, and you just start randomly putting together, you're never going to produce a specific needed part that's going to be part of an overall structure. It statistically, you can show it could never happen. Now, here's an example. We found this bacteria, and inside of the bacteria, scientists discovered there are 7 perfectly formed purple gears. Around those purple gears are 21 little green gears. Now, those are like a bunch of proteins had together to form that exact shape. If the gear's the wrong shape, it's in the wrong position, it's missing any of the cogs, it's not there, those little gears aren't going to turn the big gears, and they're not going to turn the little hairs that form a propeller that allow the little bacteria to swim around. Statistically, it is a scientific impossibility for a bunch of Lego blocks to form the right gear. Now, so what do people who want to leave God out say? Well, they say, oh, wow, look how useful that is. Natural selection just selected things that were useful and formed the gear. Well, we're going to talk about that in a moment. It could never happen. It's a belief that you can show is testably impossible. But the only alternative is it's a machine, God must have made it. But what turns the gears? Turns out, after 10 years of study, scientists using electron microscopes and all sorts of chemical analysis discovered there are 40 different proteins that make 40 different specific parts that form a little electric motor that turn each one of those purple gears. So behind the gear, there's an electric motor made of 40 parts. Now, nobody on this planet could look at an electric motor turning a fan and say, wow, all of those parts just made themselves the perfect size and shape, and then they just randomly came together somewhere in a junkyard somewhere, and they fell in exactly the right position, and then they turned into an electric motor. You see, for evolution to work, everything has to be there. If an organism, a little bacteria, was spending all this time and energy making all these proteins and made all of them except for one, it would have wasted all of its energy making all this stuff that's worthless junk, because you could just pull one part out of a motor and it doesn't work. Everything has to be there or nothing works. And again, it is obvious using science that the very mechanisms of evolution, a little gradual, one step at a time change, every change has to have some function or purpose, or the organism's wasting its energy. It's at a disadvantage. It's going to go extinct. And for a motor to make itself is absurdly ridiculous. You could put 10,000 of these motors in the width of a human hair. They run at 96% efficiency. Human motors are about 60% efficient. They can go 20,000 RPMs and stop at a quarter turn. Nothing humanity has ever made remotely approaches the efficiency or abilities of this motor that God has made, and we pretend it made itself. You start to understand why Christians reject the idea that evolution is true and acknowledge there's certain things God had to have done, and that's the creation of life and all of its complexity. Now let's look at another example as we're thinking about that gear and just the gear in the motor. There is an animal called a leafhopper, and it's sort of like built to jump. There are all sorts of varieties. It's about 20,000 species. Now that doesn't mean that God literally on that day of creation where he is literally supernaturally making different body structures of animals, he made all 20,000 structures on that day, because God, being outside of time, knows whatever he makes is going to have to survive in a fallen creation someday. I suspect he could have just recreated everything, but he already knew it was going to happen. So he built the ability in animals to adapt and modify and change and fit different environments. And he put the programming into the DNA of the different kind of creatures so they would stay a certain body structure, very specific different kinds of creatures, but lots of variety within a given kind. That's the biblical viewpoint. Now, the hind legs are designed for jumping in all of these creatures. Matter of fact, when it takes off, it accelerates at 400 G-force. Now, that's 400 times the acceleration of gravity pulling something into the ground. Just for comparison, when jet pilots and astronauts are being trained, when they hit about 10 Gs, they're in danger of blacking out, and they need to test these astronauts and pilots to see are they going to survive this kind of thing. So they'll put them in a centrifuge that spins around and around and around in a room, and it's going faster and faster and faster. That's what builds up this sense of acceleration. Here's what 10 Gs looks like. 10 times the acceleration of gravity. These two ladies are moving forward so fast, their faces are being shoved backwards. Now, here's the problem that science discovered. Hang on just a second. When this animal, its little brain, sends out a signal, jump, to those huge, long, lever-like back legs, the nerve has to go down, a nerve fiber, and then split and go to the right leg and the left leg. What turns out, those legs respond so fast for it to jump like a bullet coming out of a gun. You're talking the real small nymph. That's a baby immature leafhopper. It's like a grain of sand. It still has those legs. Now, when it jumps, it doesn't weigh much. It can accelerate like a bullet. It's like it literally will disappear from view. It's so fast. The signal is going to reach one of those legs sooner than the other, and it's going to respond so fast it would be shoved sideways. It's like if you're standing up and you shove with just your right leg, you're not going to go in a straight line. You're going to go sideways. But it doesn't. When it jumps, it goes in a straight line. So they're trying to figure out, how does it do that? The signal should split and reach one of the legs sooner than the other, and it shouldn't go in a straight line. They discovered deep down inside of the insect, this is what they found. 2 perfectly formed gears. Now, someone trained, evolution's a fact, evolution explains everything, millions and millions of years, slow changes over gradual eons of generations, slowly transform something into these gears. Look how useful those gears are. That evolution made them. Evolution explains it, little slow changes. And students are going to hear that. Well, what they need to ask is, could that be true? Does it really make sense? You see, Okay, I'm going to take us off full screen again. I'm going to do a little demonstration. So if you can bring me back, Donnie. Okay, bring me back to full screen. For those gears to form themselves, I don't know how you do that. Okay, here we go. You would have to have an insect that wasn't a leafhopper, that didn't have that gear, that eventually turned into the leafhopper. So let's say we have an insect that's just got some little round thing. I mean, a gear is so perfectly shaped. It couldn't just happen by chance. So you get something that's not a gear. A mutation is like hitting it with a hammer. You know, that's a mutation. Random change, random change, random change, random change. Well, you might start to get a little fin. Well, now you've got an insect that's got something inside with a little thing sticking out. It's just going to grind away at the inside of the insect. The insect's going to die. Or maybe you'll get two little things that's grinding away. Or maybe you'll get one over here and one over here. Well, now they're just going to lock up and the legs are going to lock up. It's going to die. Or maybe you'll get a couple little nubs and a couple long ones and a couple short ones. Or maybe we get some that are sticking straight out and some this way. Every time there's a random change, it's worthless. The animal's going to die. You have to have perfectly formed fins, exactly the right number, exactly the right angle. You have to have a right-hand gear and a left-hand gear. And even if you have the gears, then you have to have something attaching the legs to the gears so that if one leg starts to move, the gears move both legs in perfect unison. And then you have to somehow have a muscle or a little protein that pulls it forward. That has to be attached to a nerve that didn't used to be there that leads it to the brain. And the brain has to know what to do with all this stuff that didn't used to be there. If the nerve's missing, if the fiber's missing, if the instinct's missing, if the attachment's missing, if the gears aren't perfect, if everything isn't absolutely there, nothing works. The animal's extinct. It's impossible. The only reasonable understanding of something as simple as the gears inside of an insect is that they had to have been created all at once. And that's only going to happen supernaturally. See, God doesn't hide from us. He wants us to know he exists. And it's by observing these kind of things and not just being brainwashed into this absolutely impossible belief of evolution and small change over huge periods of time that we absolutely know God did these things. Because evolution doesn't work. When you really examine it, you can't explain how a little step at a time is going to be useful, functional, and not detrimental. And that's just one example from one creature. All right, let's go back to the full screen. Thank you, Donnie. And let's look at another critter. And I'm going to go for about 15 more minutes so we have plenty of time for questions. I actually have way more in this presentation than I have time to talk about. But let's look at this little fish in the ocean. That the video I'm about to show you is by David Edinburgh. He's an atheist evolutionist that has to explain everything about God, and he calls this nature's greatest artist. Watch this little video. Is it going to play? I might not be able to play the video. Bummer. Okay, let me try this. See if it plays.
Unfortunately,
Good.
this small Japanese pufferfish
is the audio coming through?
To the point of invisibility.
Yes, it is, Bruce. Coming in good.
He is probably nature's greatest artist. To grab a female's attention, he creates something that almost defies belief. His only tools are his fins. In his head, a plan of mathematical perfection. He plows the sand, breaking it up into the finest of particles. These shells aren't just rubbish to be removed. He uses them to decorate the bridges of his construction. He can't rest for more than a moment, but must work 24 hours a day for a week, or the current will destroy his creation. A final tidy up, and his masterpiece is complete. Nowhere else in nature does an animal construct something as complex and perfect as this. If this doesn't get him noticed, nothing will. Unfortunately, this...
Okay. Now, why did David Edinburgh say at the very end, if this doesn't get him noticed, nothing will? Because if you want to leave God out, you have to explain everything without God. One of the things that really, really, really bothered Charles Darwin, who first proposed that one animal slowly modified itself to turn into another, and that's been accepted as fact by the scientific community by and large today, was where did beauty come from? You see, Darwin's, one of his major goals was to totally destroy people's belief in God. His daughter had died at a young age. He's been trained that the rock layers are filled with death, and it's been going on this way for hundreds of millions of years. So God must have just made death. Death's been around all through these rock layers, so it's just part of what God made. So he reasons, my daughter just died of death. God's always made death. What kind of God is this? And he basically became an atheist. He set out to destroy everybody's belief in God. But what bothered him was the beauty of creation. Why would animals expend so much energy, so much biological effort and energy to create beauty? And this is a statement by Charles Darwin. The sight of a feather in a peacock's tail, whenever I gaze at it, makes me sick. Now, peacocks are flat out gorgeous, but he was so dedicated to getting God out of his thinking, it made him sick that they were so beautiful and he couldn't explain it. Well, since that time, evolutionists have just repeated generation after generation after generation that beauty exists because it has a function. Excuse me. Okay, sorry. So, for instance, for decades, when I was going through science class and biology, I remember being taught that flowers are so colorful so that they can attract insects. And they're more likely to be pollinated, and they'll have an advantage, and there'll be more of that kind of flower. Except we've now discovered that insects are colorblind. So when we take that concept and test it, it turned out not to be true. They also tested several decades ago this idea that peacocks are so beautiful so they can attract a mate. That fish makes that beautiful sculpture so it can attract a mate. So they cut off all of these gorgeous, iridescent, eye-shaped feathers on the back of this peacock. Now, this is the male. So I mean, without all those feathers, you've got a bunch of ugly stalks sticking out. So you got a pug ugly peacock male. They send him into a field with a bunch of gorgeous males strutting their stuff. And then they got this really ugly guy. And then they send in the females, the peahens. Turned out it made absolutely no statistical difference how often the female picked the ugly guy compared to the really good looking guys. In other words, when you test the belief that beauty exists because it has a function, science shows us it's not true. Now, does that mean beauty can't also have a function in a different addition to being beautiful? Absolutely. There are definitely examples of where things that are beautiful have some sort of functional advantage. But there are just as many examples of when beauty seems to have absolutely no advantage, which means these creatures have spent all sorts of energy creating beauty, and it's been just a total waste of time. See, it contradicts the whole concept of evolution. Beauty exists because it reflects the nature of our Creator. That's why it exists primarily. And he can also give it a function. Let's look at a little fish that does what no other fish does. It's called the oopu fish. By the way, all of these examples I've written 4 different every day of the year creation devotionals that deal with genetics and biology and microbiology and physics and cosmology and anthropology and geology. Every day of the year, a different topic. Many of them are these kind of animals. This guy's actually a superhero. Now, this is why I say that. He does what no other fish in the world can do. He only lives in this one specific area of the world. It's off the big island of Hawaii, out in the saltwater. But like a salmon, this fish has to lay its eggs in fresh water. If he lays it in salt water, the eggs die. There'll be no more oopu fish. It goes extinct. But the only fresh water anywhere near this fish lives, in that area of the coral reefs off Hawaii, is upstream of this waterfall. Now, this waterfall is 420 feet high. It, around the clock, around the year, has massive flows of water plummeting down into a pool beneath. And if a fish lays its eggs down at the bottom of that pool, they just get flushed out into the ocean and they die. So it has to lay its eggs upstream of this waterfall. It's 420 feet tall. Now, this is one of the demonstrations I do when I go into these overseas high schools. I ask the students, how does that fish get to the top of that waterfall? And they'll often say fly, because they've heard of flying fish. But I explain that those are just specially designed, not evolved, specially designed and modified fins that allow it to jump out of the water and glide for a long way. But it can't flap them, and it could never go more than 20 or 30 feet above the waves. And then some students will shout out climb, and I kind of ask them, kind of like Spider-Man, and they all laugh. But I say, you got the right idea, but the wrong superhero. You see, what this fish has on its stomach is a perfectly formed suction cup. Now, there are fish that use their mouths as suckers and can climb over rocks in order to jump upstream. But as far as I know, this is the only fish in creation with a perfectly formed suction cup. It's the oopu fish. Now, how does evolution explain this? By the way, it sticks itself to the rock and shoves with its hind fin, stick shoves, takes it somewhere between 3 and 5 days, and it will literally free climb 420 feet against flowing water to the top of that waterfall and then jump out and swim upstream and spawn and produce eggs, and then they're flushed back into the ocean. Now, this is incredible. How evolution can't explain this, because you can't just take 2 pectoral fins in one generation and in the next generation, oh, it's a perfect suction cup. If anybody's ever tried to stick a suction cup somewhere, if there's any little nick or any little piece missing, or if it's not perfectly flexible, it doesn't work. Imagine a fish with half a suction cup in a coral reef. It's getting stuck in the coral, it's flapping around, it's slowing it down, it's going to get eaten. Any small step along the way, just a random change to those fins, is going to make them useless and non-functional, and the fish is going to die. It's, once again, unless it's perfect, and everything's there, and it has the instincts, and it has the need, nothing's going to work. It had to have the suction cup at the same time it needed to start laying eggs in fresh water. So again, you see how all the parts had to be made at once. I'm going to jump past this because I know we're running short on time, but it's an animal that you can't boil it, you can't freeze it, you can't irradiate it, you can't crush it. It's called a tardigrade. Whatever you do to this little animal with 8 legs, there's another one, it survives. It just doesn't die. You can even dehydrate it, take the water away, and it still comes back to life. There had to be hundreds, if not thousands, of chemical changes inside of this creature to allow it to do that. I want to mention a sea sapphire. This is a creature, it's a brilliant blue color, but its entire body, lives in the ocean, is made out of small little transparent plates, kind of like butterfly scales, except they're transparent. Now, when it's facing directly toward you, it's got just multiple layers of these glass plates. They're not glass, but they're a transparent protein, hard structure. When light hits it, all of the wavelengths of light get absorbed except for blue, and blue will bounce back. So it looks blue. But when it turns, the blue will now go through the transparent plate because the wavelength distance between the glass layers has changed. Its entire internal structure is made out of a clear fluid. The backside of it is made out of clear plates. So when this creature turns, light goes directly through the entire creature, bounces off the ocean floor, and then bounces back up through it, and it becomes invisible. Now, I'm talking about the awe of God here. God literally created an invisible creature that when it turns, it becomes invisible. Light just goes right through it and comes right back again. I'm going to run a little film that goes on a loop. Watch it as it turns, and you'll see the sea floor right underneath of it. So here it is. You see, you're looking through it, and you can see the ocean underneath of it. That guy just turned invisible. Now he's visible again. Visible, invisible. Visible, invisible. Isn't that incredible? God didn't just give animals the ability to disguise themselves. He gave a critter the ability to become invisible. Our next creature is the honeybee. Now, the honeybee has a brain the size of a grain of sand. Our brains are like thousands and thousands of times bigger. Harvard University researchers decided to do an experiment to see how quick bees could pass along information, and it depend on distance, or to depend on change, or did they just remember things? So they took a honeybee in a hive and they marked all the bees in that hive. I think it was like with a radiation, some sort of marker, so that when a bee from that hive showed up at a source of food, they would knew it was from that hive. So then they put a whole bunch of rich nectar about 200 feet away. So as soon as the first bee from that hive showed up, they started a stopwatch. Click. What bees will do when they find a field full of great flowers or a bunch of flowers that haven't been yet, pollinated, they will fly back to their hive and tell the other bees. Now they do this, the very center of that picture, there's a bee doing a dance, and all the other bees are watching it. So the bee looks at the angle from the nest, the hive, to the sun is the focal point of the angle, and then that same angle to where the flower's at. And in this case, it would be 115 degrees. So then he flies back to the hive, and from the vertical direction of the honeycomb, he does a dance that's oriented 158 degrees from that vertical standard of reference. So the bees watching him now know we have to fly 115 degrees from our hive where the sun is, and we'll find this really good food. Then, depending on whether it goes around in a series of figure eights or the series of circles and how many times, they know how far to fly. So the honeybee, by doing this dance, is telling the other bees what direction and how far to fly to find the food. Okay, evolution believers. How does this happen? 1 million, 2 million, 10 million years ago, a bee shows up and he starts doing a dance in the middle of the honeycomb. the other bees, they're not going to know what he's doing. They're not going to have a clue why he's doing it. It has to be programmed into them from the beginning, or it's meaningless. And this is a grain of sand-sized brain. So now the researchers move it 400 feet away, start the stopwatch. The bee flies back, tells the other bees. About 10 minutes later, they show up. 600 feet away, he flies back after he first finds it, tells the other bees. 10 minutes later, they show up. So, they cover up the food, wait for all the bees to disperse. There's none around from that hive. They move it 800 feet away now in the same direction, 200 feet, then 200 more, then 200 more, then 200 more. They uncover the food. They turn on their detector. But instead of waiting for the bee to show up, there are hundreds of bees from the hive already there waiting for them to show up with the food. See, these little insects with their teeny little brain, they saw the pattern, they saw it repeated, they saw it happening in the same direction time after time. Instead of wasting energy flying back to the hive, they just flew on ahead to where they knew the food was going to show up and waited for the researchers to show up with their food. These bees outsmarted the researchers. And that's a little tiny insect. The things God made have incredible capabilities for adapting, changing, and knowing things that couldn't just happen by random chance. Now I'm going to end with two more examples. One of them I want to use just to give folks that are watching resources. I've been at this for 30 years. I produced an 18-part creation curriculum that deals with geology and biology and genetics and astronomy and so on. And several of them work with inventions that have been discovered because we'd observed what God made and then just simply copied it. Inventions that have changed all of human nature, or inventions that have just invented us and benefited us in small ways. Now, in addition to these 18 45-minute teachings that I call The Rocks Cry Out, and you'll find them on my website, searchforthetruth.net, I've produced over 100 little 2 and 3 minute videos that are just kind of like this daily reminder that I put them out about one every 2 weeks. If you sign up on my website for these, without a doubt, we can know God exists without a doubt, without doubting that he exists. These come out in an email to you every couple weeks. So I want you to watch one of them about one of these really cool creatures God made. And in this case, it's a slug, but not just what it does, but how it's benefited us. So watch this little film, number 20 in the Without a Doubt series you'll find on my website.
God told us to take dominion over creation in the book of Genesis. That means to study, understand, and control it. Now, why? Because we can learn so much from it. I mean, we can even learn from a slug. A slug, you say? Yeah. It turns out that there's a certain kind of slug that lives in Northern Europe that slugs, when they move, they leave a slime trail. It's just kind of a sticky, gooey, watery thing. You can actually see their trail as they're crawling along. Well, scientists started to study this slug from Europe, and they realized their slime is very, very elastic, which means you can stretch it and it'll snap back, and very, very sticky. Now, for years, scientists have used things like super glue to bind up wounds, and they thought, it's a little toxic and it turns a little brittle. What we need is a really flexible glue that will stay sticky. And they discovered this slug slime and thought, these has the perfect characteristics for glue. Now, don't get too excited about, having some slug slime slapped onto your cut, because it takes a lot of slugs to form enough slime to fit the market. And, slug slime farms aren't exactly practical, because the slugs only exude this kind of slime when they're scared, because they don't want birds. Like if a bird's flying overhead, out comes the sticky slug slime glue. And if the bird comes and tries to pull the slug off the sidewalk, it's stuck to the sidewalk. So the only way to get the sticky glue is to scare the slugs. And slug slime farms aren't exactly practical. I mean, you set up a movie theater, you put all your slugs on the seats, and you show them movies of scary birds, and then you scrape the slug slime sticky glue off the seats? I mean, not exactly practical. So what do? They figured out how to synthesize it. And we now have the formula for sticky slug slime glue that is currently being used to seal up wounds. Isn't that cool? Because we figured out what God did first. So we can learn from creation, develop products that benefit us in a multitude of ways, even slug slime glue. What a slugger of an idea.
So I took time to do that just to show you there's tools you can use. And you'll notice I was kind of thinking and stumbling, and these things aren't scripted. There's no teleprompter. I'm just taking 35 years of experience of speaking and teaching and kind of sharing things. And I hope you'll put them to use and find them useful. Now I'm going to end with this one. And this one is just stunning. It's the marine iguana. Again, it's one of the pages out of these creation devotionals. 3 paragraphs about this little critter. And he does what no other vertebrate. I mean, you look at every bird, every amphibian, every mammal, everything in creation that has a backbone. This is the only one that can do what this animal does. Now, he's a vegetarian, and he has to go in the water to get his food, kelp and plankton and algae and stuff, and he eats it, except he has a problem. His island, where he lives in the South Pacific, is surrounded by sharks. And sharks have horrible eyesight, but really, really good hearing. And when he's in that water swimming, he's about 4 or 5 foot long, great big lizard. His heart beating underwater, it's going boom, 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 boom. It sounds like nothing else. The shark just zeroes right into it and whomp, great big bratwurst sandwich, yum. Just a tasty little dessert for everything else they've been eating all day long. And so if he goes out to swim, he's going to be eaten by sharks. If he doesn't go out to swim, he's going to starve to death. So he dies if he does, and he dies if he doesn't. So what's the poor little iguana going to do? Well, turns out this guy decides he doesn't want the sharks to hear his heart beating. So he turns off his heart before he crawls into the water. Now he swims around for up to 40 minutes, goes around, gets his stomach nice and full, no heart beating for 40 minutes, no blood circulating by the heart up to feed his brain and his muscles and everything, just swimming around eating. Then he crawls back on the shore, and unfortunately, then he flops over dead because he forgot to evolve the ability to turn his heart back on. What a bummer. Yeah, you understand why I said what I'm getting at here? Unless everything is there in any of these amazing abilities these animals have, in the amazing structures they have inside of their body, it just doesn't work. For this guy to not be able to shut off his heart and then shut it off, there's got to be a way when that first happens for the blood to get pumped around in some other way. The muscles themselves be in such a way or a shape or structured in such a position that every time he moves, it's moving the blood around and circulating it and getting it up to the brain. There's got to be all sorts of chemical changes so he can survive for long periods of time with no heart beating. Even fish constantly have their heart beating. So scientists will probably spend the next decade trying to figure out how in the world this creature does this, but there will be hundreds and hundreds of chemical and physical changes needed to make it all work. That isn't going to happen one step at a time. See, an animal doesn't just adapt and get a new ability. You don't take a pigeon and drop it in Antarctica and it turns into a penguin. Enormous changes have to be there before it could ever have survived in the first place when it's living in sub-temperature freezing conditions or swimming around with no heartbeat. So God's creation is just filled with these examples that one small random mutational change at a time could never add an increasing level of functional information. It could never bring chemicals alive, and it could never transform one creature into another when you actually take time to examine it and think about that process. They are supernaturally created. The box that represents the universe could not have made itself. Life found in the universe could never have made itself. And bacteria could never slowly transform themselves into different forms of life. Those are three enormous lies of evolution that are demonstrably false. Now, have I proven creation is true scientifically? No. But if the box didn't make itself, the only option left is that the box has a box maker. And these are the ways God reveals it is a truth and scientific reality that he exists. All right, so with that, let's pull the screen back up and go to some questions and discussion.
Bruce, that, my brother, was incredible. Any objective thinking critic or skeptic would have to look at that and have no choice but to turn to God and praise God, because that was truly incredible. And I learned so many points there, brother.
Well,
slugs.
No, I just wanted to add before we leave that very thought you just
Of
had.
course, yeah.
Just the motor, just 40 parts of that little molecular motor and nothing else. But I've just scratched the surface. There are literally millions of examples throughout the biological world. They're every bit as stunning as that. And every one of them are unexplainable by slow modification, a piece at a time, because the animal doesn't survive during that process of changing one into another. So nobody is going to stand in front of God someday and say, I would have believed in you, I would have obeyed you if you'd have just made it clear to me. Creation makes it crystal clear. Everybody's without excuse. So now go ahead with the thought about the slime slug.
No, that was perfectly said. There's a lot of positive feedback, Bruce, coming from the live chat. People saying it's fascinating. You did a great job. And personally, I learned a ton from that presentation, Bruce. I could listen to you for another 3 hours covering all of those examples. You nailed it there. Just as the Bible says, we're without excuse. Nobody is going to stand before God and say, God, where was the evidence for you? Where were you? He's not hiding, as you said during the program, Bruce. And I just find it amazing. Slugs, bees, fish, peacocks, grasshoppers,
bacteria,
all pointing to the reality and the power of God. Isn't that why the Bible says that we're not to put our faith, Bruce, in the wisdom of man, but in the power of God?
It is, and I will expand on that again. I love it that we can have a discussion back and forth. Ever since Adam and Eve, okay, it's like, once again, you have two choices. God will never take our freedom of choice away. He will never force us to believe. We can choose to deny things if we choose. So either God made the first two people, Adam and Eve, or something that wasn't a person turned into a person. There are no other options. And it's only by refusing to want to believe the first one, that God's literally made people in his image, that you're stuck with the second one. Some sort of an apish thing must have turned into us. And that's a whole talk in and of itself, with all the issues and problems that are hidden and not discussed. But ever since Adam and Eve sinned against God, took their freedom, rejected God as the one who's in charge, decided, I want to make the rules, I want to be my own God, the natural bent, the natural tendency of every single human being is to hide from God and to justify our own behavior and to make up our own religious rules. That is the history of humanity. Adam's first response was to cover himself with fig leaves and to hide from God. That's symbolic of covering our own sins and pretending God doesn't exist. Evolution is just the latest attempt, and it's only been prevalent in the last 150 or so years, of mankind trying to hide from God and cover, and pretend he doesn't even exist in order to hide from their own sins. And it's not science. It's just another belief system.
It's just another belief system. You're absolutely right. And all of your examples were incredible. I was so amazed by the last one, the marine iguanas.
Oh, yeah.
I just had to double check. And yes, here on Google, there's several articles that say marine iguanas of the Galapagos Islands can dramatically slow their heart rate, a phenomenon called bradycardia. I was a nurse for 6 years, so I know all about that, tachycardia, bradycardia. But it says this, and can even stop. This is what blew my mind, Bruce.
Yeah.
And can even stop their heart for up to 45 minutes while diving. That right there is Marvel Comics, X-Men type mutant powers.
Oh, I know. It's the one that tardigrade that you can boil it, you can freeze it, you can irradiate it, you can dry it out, and it just pops back to life. That's like the Wolverine X-Man. It's like you got the invisibility, you got the mortality, you got the super brilliance, you got the super speed. It's like it's all these superheroes are just copying things God is. Yeah.
You see how we get the truth of God and the truth of the Bible in everything that man does, everything that man makes. You provided several examples for biomimicry, that we basically look to God's design and then invent and engineer things based on the way God's designed the biological world. Or you can look to all these stories and comic books and mythologies, and we find analogs there as well to the biological world, for example, with these just truly amazing abilities from these creatures, Bruce.
Yeah, that we do.
So many challenges then come to mind, and I posted them in the live chat because we get a good mix of critics and non-critics. And I at times engage in formal debate with Evolution, so I like to ask them these challenges. And so now I have this in mind. Well, firstly, before I go over the challenges, I kept thinking this when you were presenting these incredible abilities from these different creatures, Bruce. When many completely different organisms, from a bird to an insect like a grasshopper or a bee to a reptile, when all of these different creatures, wildly different creatures, are displaying engineering beyond human capability, Bruce, doesn't that strongly suggest a common designer rather than common descent? Because common descent proponents would say, well, all these different creatures ranging from insects to birds to reptiles, they all go back to a common ancestor. But how are these incredible abilities built up over time through, as you said, mutations and selection and gene flow? It's just not possible, is it, Bruce?
Well, it isn't. Dr. Gary Galuza, he's the head of the Institute for Creation Research, one of the major creation research organizations in the world. They've been around for about 60 years, studying creation from a biblical perspective, but using science. He spoke last year at Harvard University. They had him in open auditorium to the whole university group, and he made this statement. He said, there is, in the entire world, in all of scientific literature, there is not a single example, not one example of any mutation which has added a higher level of information content to the creature. And there was no rebuttal. Nobody could refute that. See, whenever there's a mutation, it rearranges information or it destroys information, but it never adds a higher level of complexity to the information, like a whole new sentence or a whole new chapter. It's just rearranging a word, rearranging a letter. Now, occasionally what shows up in all the textbooks is by rearranging that information in a very specific environment, that animal may have lost an ability, but now maybe it gives it an advantage. Like a salamander or a fish that goes into a cave and now it becomes blind because there's a mutational change. It no longer has to use a bunch of its brain function to try to see when there's no light there anyway. So it frees up the brain it actually functions better than if it was trying to see. And it's like, oh, there's a positive mutation. See, that animal works better because it's mutated. Well, that's exactly analogous to saying, maybe suppose you were in a movie theater with 500 people and one of those people was blind and the lights went out and someone screamed fire in panic. Of those 500 people, which person is going to function best? The blind man. Is that blind man more highly evolved and in the process of changing into something other than a human being? No, it's absurd. So even when students are shown things that seem to say, oh, here's here's a change that's in the way of transforming one animal to another. It's not causing upward evolution to happen. It's all smoke and mirrors. So back to your question, but don't we see a common lineage, a common linkage of animals all the way back? No, we really don't. All we see are capabilities, features, and functions that are used in a multitude of places throughout creation. Just like a good architect would use the fundamentals of what makes a good, well-designed, stable bridge in a lot of different ways in order to create a lot of different looking bridges, but still have the same fundamentals. The creator of the universe and life used the same fundamental principles and the same basic set of chemicals to create all of life, so that life can interact. It can eat itself. It can, provide nourishment by using the same chemicals in its body that came from other animals. The same things that are needed for survival would work in different environments. Doesn't prove that one turned into another. One example of that, and I skipped this, it's also in my presentation, but I want to make sure there's time for discussion. Chemiluminescence is a process where two chemicals are mixed together to produce light. This shows up, I believe last time I looked, in about 38 different, totally disconnected organisms throughout the biological world. It shows up in mushrooms in the Amazon jungle. It shows up in plankton in the ocean. It shows up in fireflies, in insects. It shows up in squids. It shows up in fish. So fish and squids and seaweed and plankton and mushrooms and firefly insects, they're all completely biologically disconnected. So it's not like one of them slowly turned into another. Right. It's just this ability suddenly appears in totally disconnected creatures. Now, how does that happen by an evolutionary relationship? It couldn't, because that ability had to have completely disappeared in the sea creature before it reappeared in the land animal. Had to completely disappear in the mushroom before it appeared into an insect. Well, it's an incredibly complex process. You have to have two specific chemicals. They have to be produced specifically chemically perfect. They have to be kept apart in storage structures. They have to have some way of bringing them together and mix them. There has to be a catalyst present. There has to be a transparent place where the light is able to get out of the creature and be seen. And all of it has to be there, or the creature's wasted its energy producing chemicals that are of no use that it could have used for other things in its survival. So you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
You can't just line them up. You can't just show some linkage between these creatures. They're there because God put them there so we would be in awe of him and acknowledge they couldn't have just made themselves. And that's the logical conclusion if you don't choose to leave God out of your thinking.
So many good points there, Bruce, that I'd love to expand on. On that particular example, that's why the evolutionary story is just that. It's a story. It's a fairy tale, in my opinion, because that incredible function, that very sophisticated function you just described, Bruce, because we find that popping up in the biological world in very disconnected organisms. Well, to the evolutionists, then, what they'll have to invoke, if I were to put myself in their heads, is convergent evolution, rather than that function being inherited from common ancestors, since everything, according to their model, goes back billions of years ago to a single common ancestor, and then you have these branching patterns in the tree of life.
Let's start with the bacteria. Yep.
Right. And so that means that function would have had to evolve many different times independently, yet they can't even show us how it evolved once through a step-by-step mutational pattern.
The two chemicals, luciferine and luciferase, that you have to mix together to form light, they are proteins. They are so incredibly complex. You have to line up the amino acids in exactly the right order, and there are hundreds of amino acids long. And if there's 20 or 100 different amino acids out there that to be formed during Miller's experiment of some random arrangement of methane and ammonia that formed amino acids, and they've never even shown where the right ones all came from. You can't with blind chance get them to line up in the right order to even make even one of the right chemicals.
Wow.
That's never been shown. I think you would win the Nobel Prize if you could show how that could happen. But it's never been shown how you can make even one biologically useful protein, because it's statistically impossible. So we know it can't happen. And again, this whole lining up thing, I could go to a junkyard and dig around and maybe find an old rusted, beat up pieces of a tricycle, and some other part of the junkyard find some, pieces of a bicycle, and maybe pieces of a motorcycle, and then an old rusted out car. And I could line up, the structure of a tricycle, bicycle, motorcycle, and car. Have I now proven the tricycle has turned into the car? No, I haven't proven anything. And to hang on to the evolutionary tree belief system, you have to believe the bacteria branched out and turned into everything.
Right.
So you got to line things up. So the game that is played is you accept the things that fit your dogma, which is all of biology came from a single form of life, a bacteria. So the things that will fit and that you can line up and they sort of make sense, they'll show in the textbooks. The things that don't fit, they'll throw a word, convergent evolution, at it and say, it just evolved independently.
Yeah.
So you pick and select. You choose what fits your belief system. You reject what doesn't fit your belief system. Now, Christians are just as guilty of this throughout time. They hang on to dogmas that really weren't biblical facts anyway. And they reject things that don't fit their dogma. Matter of fact, all human beings do that. Mm-hmm. That's the problem with indoctrination versus education. When you indoctrinate, you form a fixed structure of what's true, and you involuntarily, subconsciously accept what fits that framework and reject what doesn't. And sadly, we are multiple generations into the scientific world of training, generation after generation of people involved in scientific research, that evolution's a fact and the millions and billions of years are a fact. So anything that contradicts it just isn't even shown and is immediately rejected. But there's lots of evidence supporting both a recent creation and the absolute impossibility of evolution.
Well said. One example comes to mind based on what you said there, going back to your presentation on grasshoppers. What an incredible challenge for evolution. So from my understanding on that particular example, and here's a challenge for the evolutionists, for the gears to work, the teeth, spacing, cut depth, material hardness, neural timing, and leg musculature must all appear together. And
you do. And you can't refute that. Let me show you some of the deception that goes on. I was actually in a debate on a radio with an evolutionist probably 15 years ago, public radio. So in the host and the evolutionist that was in to speak at the local university, they were tag teaming, stacked against me. But I brought up Darwin's Black Box was written probably 2 decades ago that talked about a mousetrap being irreducibly complex.
Yes.
And that's what these gears are, or what the electric motor is, or what the shutting down of the heart. There's a certain things that all have to be there for it to work, or that animal dies. He just is a disadvantage. He goes extinct. And a mousetrap would be like the gear. Okay, a mousetrap, a classic mousetrap with a little a little U-shaped hammer that comes and smashes the mouse. It has to have a platform. It has to have this hammer. It has to have a spring that will spring it forward. It has to have a little latch that you can hold the hammer back. And then it has to have a little platform to put a piece of cheese. So it has to have all 5 parts. If any of those parts are missing, nothing works. So it's not like you just have to have a part. You have to have all 5 parts, and they have to be in the right position. So I presented this to the guy defending evolution. I forget what his name was, but he was high up there in the evolutionary world. And he says, well, yeah, we hear about this irreducible complexity all the time, but it's not true. For instance, I could take away the little catch and see, now I've got the base, and I've got the hammer, and I've got the latch, and I could stick it here on my shirt, and I could use it as a tie clip. See, it's got it perfectly useful as a tie clip, and it's only got 4 of the parts. And but see how silly that is?
Right. Yeah.
It's the tie catch could never function as a useful part as needed to catch a mouse. The point is, the whole thing is needed for that animal to survive, to do what it does, which in this case would be to catch a mouse. In the leafhopper case would be to move both legs simultaneously without grinding up the interior of the creature. So if you just have part of the parts, it's a detriment.
Right.
Doesn't matter if it's could in conceptually contrived way be used in a different way. That doesn't help you explain how it ever was able to be used the way it needed to be used.
If their response to that has any scientific basis, Bruce, if they were to try and pull that on the grasshopper example, for example, you know, we might
It's a leafhopper. Just to so you get
a leafhopper.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So a leafhopper, and if we were to ask the question, what mechanism produces multiple coordinated traits simultaneously, and they were to put forth an answer like that, well, I would think if common descent were true, if evolution were true, Bruce, where then are the millions of failed experiments, half ears, half patterns, broken systems in the fossil record? They love to look at the fossil record and then line things up, like you said.
Yeah.
And I think you made a great analogy. I mean, I could say, okay, we've got a four-wheeler, and we've got a tricycle, and then, you know, a unicycle. So as an evolutionist, there must be something out there with two wheels, and lo and behold, we find a bicycle, and they line it up, and, you know, one evolved into the next.
It's just the belief. Yep. And you know, there are similarities. Similarity doesn't prove dissent in another way. I mean, I could have a Ferrari and I could have a Volkswagen, and you know, they're probably 95% similar parts. They got steering wheels and pistons and engines and gear, you know, bearings and seats and brakes and, you know, all the same systems. But that doesn't prove that the Volkswagen could turn into the Ferrari all by itself with just random changes. It doesn't prove anything. It just proves they have a common designer. It's another example of the same thing.
Well, and because we got a lot of critics in the chat, and so maybe they can leave a comment, show us if common descent were true, and this leafhopper, right, Bruce?
Yes.
Could evolve these functions, these sophisticated functions. Then where are the millions and millions of failed experiments leading up to the experiment that was successful? Put it that way.
I suspect they would say a failed experiment only survived for one generation, therefore it didn't leave anything in the fossil record.
Right.
That would be their answer. And that's reasonable.
Be fossilized.
That's reasonable. But surely some of them must have partially survived. It's like none of them survived. It's just there. And by the way, there's something called orphan genes. I mean, it's just, there's layer after layer after layer of problems that's just glossed over by the intellectual evolutionary community, because they've got to hang on to this belief. See, it's a belief system. If in their mind, if you can get partway there, that's good enough. Maybe we'll learn more later to help fill in the gaps. Well, that's faith, not science. That's not showing that it's true. These orphan genes, it's like you look at, you can have a certain species of like ants, and you can, even in a given species, you'll have lots of variety of ants in a given species. Now they're interbreed, but they're the same basic kind of ant, okay? You will have ants within that species that have totally unrelated, completely disconnected genes when you do the genetic mapping of two ants in the same general classification that just suddenly appeared. That would be like having think of a couple. I do this when I'm speaking on genetics. Suppose I put together a bunch of Lego blocks and it looks like an 1800s sailing vessel, you know, big ship with a bunch of sails. And then I put together a bunch of Lego blocks using mostly the same Lego blocks. And the next thing looks like a 747 jet airplane. And then I put a bunch of Lego blocks together, and the last one looks like the Millennium Falcon from Star Wars. There's 3 different modes of transportation, all using Lego blocks, and probably 90% of the Lego blocks used in each one are the same Lego blocks. But 10% are totally new totally different Lego blocks. That's what we find in biological organisms. We find even in the very same classification of animals, orphan genes. That means they're orphans. They have no parents. They just suddenly appear. Now that is creation and has never been explained by biological evolutionists, genetic evolutionists. It's a mystery to them. And they just say, oh, we'll just give it a name and it just happened. Well, that's ridiculous.
Right. Or
So,
they'll name a mechanism.
These problems are just glossed over. They're not explained. To explain that gear, you got to explain how something that didn't have a gear slowly developed at one small change at a time. And I'd like want the people that are commenting, get back to that. How do you do it a small change at a time? What did that change look like? And how did it function? And how did it keep that animal from being detrimental to that animal? Just like the mousetrap, when he sticks a piece of the mousetrap on his necktie, well, tell me how that actually functions. Tell me how that actually benefits the animal. Tell me how the animal survived with only part of that hanging off of his body. They don't do that. They just make up a story. See, it's all storytelling, evolution storytelling. The lining up of fossils is storytelling. The assuming bacteria turned into human beings is storytelling. But as creative human beings, we find evidence to fit our story. But is it true? That's the point. See, science really works fundamentally by having a belief and trying to find an experiment that will prove your belief is wrong.
Right.
Then you will know whatever's left is probably the right answer. Because you never know for sure you know enough to know absolutely for sure you're right. It has to be falsifiable. Biological evolution, cosmic evolution, chemical evolution, those are the three areas that are sacred dogmas of science. And even though we can demonstratively show the mechanisms can't possibly be true, they're still accepted as if they are true. I freely admit that the belief in God and the belief of the Bible is a belief, but it is the only logical belief because the only alternative can't possibly be true. And we can show it scientifically.
Well, again, so many excellent points. Orphan genes, the concept of orphan genes is one of my favorite arguments for sure, Bruce, because it points us to the reality of the biblical model of created kinds, where we have these taxonomically restricted yet essential functional genes, where we find them in some species and not in others, as if they just popped into existence out of nowhere,
right,
with no evidence for ancestry, no ancestral genes.
That's
leading
exactly
up to them.
what they did.
It's amazing. And it's exactly what we'd expect. And so what they'll say, because I see this in the chat, and I know how I would address this for sure, but their typical response is this: okay, well, if we were to take the orphan gene argument literally, then you would have to believe species level creation. Creationists don't think that is correct. So basically what they're saying is this, Bruce: well, we find some orphan genes that are not necessarily genus or family specific, but species specific. So they'll point to examples of, let's say, orphan genes within species that we as creationists would agree are the same kind. So they go back to maybe a common archetype. They do this with insects and felids and dogs. And so their challenge is, okay, well, if orphan genes did not evolve, then why do we have some orphan genes in, let's say, a tiger that maybe a lion doesn't have, or some orphan genes that a chimp has, but a bonobo doesn't have? So they're kind of challenging us to be consistent. And well, we must believe orphan genes can come about as well. But I like to say, okay, when you get diversification from your original set of orphan genes, you could lose orphan genes in one lineage.
Right.
It doesn't mean that they're evolving. It just means that over time, diversification events means some orphan genes are being lost, others are being retained. Because, Bruce, isn't it much easier to break and lose something than actually build something up?
So yeah, that's well stated. I mean, we have a much easier logical defense of what our belief is by understanding we live in a fallen creation where things are constantly adapting to new environments. But the mechanisms and the programming to do that adaptation are built into the very genetic structure. everything in the biological world is constantly evaluating and communicating. The cells inside of the cell, it's evaluating what's needed to build the parts and the pieces and the resources that are needed to supply to keep the cell alive, constantly evaluating how much of this do I need, how much of that do I need, how much needs built, what needs changed. One organism is evaluating its environment, and the environment changes. We now know genes can actually be turned on and turned off,
Right.
where you will get completely different structure, shapes of animals based on the environment. It's not like the environment is making the organism add new information. The organism is measuring the environment and then turning things on and off as needed to function in the new changing environment. That is engineering design. That is not random change. So yeah, we get genes that are lost or turned off or turned on because of a robust design from the beginning. But we also see deterioration and loss of things because we live in a fallen creation, and everything is deteriorating and winding down. The opposite is really, really, really much tougher for them to defend. That you get complex structures just appearing by random change. That we don't see. And it's a much harder belief to swallow.
Excellent response. And it's interesting because I see this as circular reasoning right here, Bruce. I'd be curious as to your thoughts. And again, we appreciate our critics and skeptics. That's why we do these live, because we want to interact with your challenges as we discuss the topic. So Andrew Cumming, appreciate the comment. So he says this, and I believe this is circular reasoning. I'll tell you why. So he says orphan genes have evolved too. It's an assertion, but we'll see if you can back it up. We have seen genes appearing in the lab de novo. So what they call this is de novo gene synthesis, Bruce. And what their argument is, well, in the non-coding areas of the genome, they can evolve through beneficial mutation accumulation and become an orphan gene. Or you can get gene duplication, and then that duplicated gene eventually can evolve a novel function. But isn't this circular reasoning? Because we know orphan genes exist, as you pointed out, Bruce. So we have these orphan genes. It's a challenge for evolutionists. To us, we expect it. So they're trying to explain orphan genes. So they invent this mechanism called de novo gene synthesis. And you ask them, well, what's de novo gene synthesis? Why do you need it? And then they say, well, because we got orphan genes. So it's just this circle that they haven't really demonstrated, have they, Bruce?
Well, I'm having trouble even comprehending the logic of this. So their idea is some creature existed, slowly changed into a different creature, and then all these genes that it needed as the previous creature went into limbo somewhere and had no particular purpose or function. And then it somehow, after generation after generation after generation, it just pulls them back out again. Well, then but these genes don't exist anywhere else in the animal kingdom I'm talking about. Right. The orphan genes, they're just completely different than any gene in any other creature. So where's this ancestor that had it, that caused it to go into limbo, that somehow caused it to come back out? Way more logical to me is that God has built the programming into these creatures to have the ability to pull out extra functions as needed when environmental conditions required them to have a usefulness for them. And there's just dozens and dozens of examples of this.
Oh, exactly right. And this skeptic here says, didn't he just say it was observed in a lab setting? No, there's some papers, and I've examined them, Bruce, where they'll look at fruit flies, for example. So you got all these different species of fruit flies. We'll take that as an example. And in some lineages, you got these orphan genes, and in others, you don't. And so they're extrapolating that to mean that one lineage evolved through de novo gene synthesis, the orphan gene. But we're pointing out, no, it's much easier to break a gene or lose functionality. So what you actually have is orphan genes from creation, where some lineages have actually lost them. And they're interpreting that as, well, the lineages that still have them evolved. And they're not even thinking, well, wait a minute, no, the other lineages could have lost them. Does that make sense, Bruce?
Yeah, I think that's well stated. I can't state it any better, so I'll just leave it at that. And as far as seeing them in a lab as characteristics of an animal, I'm looking more at just gene mapping. I'm looking at the research I've read about gene mapping, where they'll take the genetic, information of and answer one of the ones I've referred back to of a given classification of ants, and then they'll look at very similar ants in that same classification. And by the way, species is a human categorization. We don't even know what a species is because within multiple generations, you can have organisms that have separated to the point they don't interbreed with the previous generation, and they become a new species. So it's purely a biological fluid classification of what even is a species. But genes they will find genes totally distinctively different than any other animal in that grouping. And that's pretty definitive. They're just there all of a sudden. To say they came from some previous form of ant, that would make them not an orphan gene. That would give them a lineage. But these are completely disconnected genes, disconnected paragraphs of information. We're not talking a letter or two here on a protein molecule. We're talking paragraphs and chapters of information that just suddenly appear.
Yeah, that's a really good analogy. So would it be akin to if we had 3 different books, all different stories, Lord of the Rings, and you can pick 2 dissimilar stories where you're going to find a lot of the same information, a lot of the same words and texts and paragraphs, but you're also going to find some words in one book that you don't find in the second book, and then some words that you find in the third book that you don't find in the second book.
But a gene is more than just a word. A gene is a large amount of information.
Right, like a paragraph or even a chapter. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And so I wanted to go back to something you said earlier, and you brought up Dr. Randy Galuza, who's done a lot of good work on rapid adaptation simply based on the environment dictating which genes are turned on and turned off.
Okay, stop.
Yeah.
This is a common fallacy across both the Christian creation community and specifically the world who is tied to natural selection driving change. The idea that the environment caused adaptation. The environment caused nothing. The environment cannot program anything. It's the organism measuring what's happening around it and adapting to to something around it. It's the organism that's adapting, not the environment making the adaptation happen. Big difference in how we think.
So would you say that the environmental conditions or stimuli, the organism is taking notice to that?
Exactly.
And adapting based on those stressors, essentially?
Yep.
That's good.
Stunning engineering system. It's not the environment that's causing something to happen. It's the organism, whatever it is, whether it's a bacteria or a fish or whatever. It's sensing what's going on around us, and it literally, we now know it is turning genes on and off. It can change its very body structure, in a matter of days, based on environmental change.
So perhaps this is akin or analogous to how these car companies, take Volkswagen, they design these cars now where, depending on what the environment is, if you're driving in the wintertime and it's a slippery road, we have anti-slip control, where now the vehicle, based on the built-in mechanisms, puts you back into place.
Right.
So it's not really the environment that's causing it. It's that the built-in mechanisms in the car.
Ice did not cause that car to have that ability. Okay,
yeah, right.
That's exactly the analogy we have with animals. It's ridiculous to think the environment added the ability of non-slip brakes to cars. It was the car given sensors that would sense that condition, and then already pre-produced by intelligence designs of hardware inside that car that accepted the sensing and changed how it would react with the brakes when that condition occurred. That's what happens inside of animals. And it's just absurdity to its highest degree to say natural selection caused that to happen.
Right. That's a great point. It's a very important point too, because we've had several critics in the chat saying that we're ignoring natural selection, which is clearly not true. And so I wanted to make this point because you were pointing out that most mutations are functionally compromising to organisms, the ones that they say are beneficial. And the point is, what evolutionists will typically put forth is a so-called beneficial mutation. They've looked to, for example, certain lineages of E. coli in Lenski's experiment. They gain the ability to digest citrate under aerobic conditions. Or another one,
the poster child of supposed beneficial mutations. And before you go on, we really need to address that. And you can if you want, or I can.
Oh no, yeah. I was gonna ask the question. Do you think that is that those kinds of changes, are they actually due to beneficial mutation accumulation, Bruce, or the pre-existing ability to adapt in light of these kinds of stressors being introduced?
Well, this is the deception that goes on in things like Miller's experiment and Lenski's experiment. Students are only given a little bit of information, and it sounds very, very conclusive. Lenski's experiment, I mean, it moved from the University of Michigan, I think, down in Texas, I believe. They took it over. And I think it's probably up over 100,000 generations by now. But about 33,000 generations in, they noticed that a variation of the E. coli started, as you correctly said, to metabolize citrate, which was one of the things that was in the sugar solution that was in their growth medium. So bacteria, like I believe about every 7 or 8 hours, they will create a new generation. So 3 generations a day, and they'll grow exponentially. So that within a day, you'll fill a petri dish with whatever the new variety of bacteria are. So this was considered incredible, that now you have a bacteria that is taking over the population in that petri dish because it's able to eat both the normal sucrose food source and this citrate, which was kind of like some sort of binder or stabilizer for the food. And it was able to eat both instead of just one. And it happened because of a mutation, a permanent mutational change to the genetic code of the bacteria. And it was publicized worldwide. It can be found in every single textbook, biology textbook now. All the high school biology textbooks, they'll all quote Lenski's experiment showing that a mutation can cause a huge advantage for bacteria as it grows, because now it can eat a kind of food it couldn't eat before. And it sounds very, very convincing. Wow, beneficial mutation. The bacteria changed. Well, here's what students aren't told. That E. coli bacteria already had the ability to eat citrate, to metabolize it and use it as a food. So it had exactly the same ability before this happened as after it happened, this random mutation. However, there's like a little switch inside of the bacteria. It's sensing its environment, and it flips a switch depending on the environment. Where there's a very low oxygen condition, it will spend its energy eating a harder to metabolize source of food, which would be citrate. It's not as efficient. It doesn't give it as much energy when it uses that instead of the normal sugar source. But when there's plenty of oxygen, like in a laboratory, it would eat just the normal sugar solution. So when the switch broke, now it will eat both. Well, in any normal environment where there was an unlimited food, just normal bacteria out there in the wild, that bacteria would be at a disadvantage, because now it's trying to metabolize a very much harder to metabolize source that gives us much less of a benefit than other food sources that are just as available. So it would go extinct. So this mutation would have driven that specific bacteria to extinction in a normal environment. It's only in an artificial laboratory environment where you have plenty of both food source that it's able to survive. So no new information was added, no new abilities was added. The bacteria is still a bacteria, nothing more complex happened, and a bacteria happened to mutate that would have a disadvantage in any other environment. And that's the poster child of proof that bacteria have changed into human beings. Do the folks who are skeptical, do they understand why we are so skeptical about the information that's being given to us? It's only partial information, and it's only being filtered in a direction that forces people to only come to one conclusion.
Wow. That was a great response, Bruce. You are an encyclopedia worth of information. And for that reason, I could literally ask you questions all day. I think you nailed it there. This is why we're skeptical when they're poster child examples of so-called novel functions are these types of examples. But like you nailed it, so are you saying it basically turned on that stressor? Turned on
the
pre-existing ability to digest.
It was permanently on for that generation on, because now that mutation is permanent. But it's not an evolutionary advancement. The ability was already there to begin with, and it's only useful in an artificial environment that isn't realistic in a natural setting.
So that bacteria, in a way, is more lazy and handicapped. You put it into the real environment, a natural environment, it's at a disadvantage.
It already has this ability in a low oxygen environment, which you find in swamps or certain places, and it may have survived perfectly fine there, but it hasn't changed into a different bacteria. It hasn't changed anything new and novel. It's doing what it's already designed to do, but now it's a broken bacteria.
It's a broken bacteria. And those kinds of changes, which one might call reductive evolution, are not going to take bacteria-like organisms into biologists over billions of years.
We're not. As Randy Galuza said, show me a single example anywhere in all of literature where you have added an increased level, a higher functional level of information because of a mutation. It doesn't exist. It's fantasy. The world is living in fantasy land and pretending that reality is fantasy.
Right.
The reality is we have a creator, and all forms of life exist because that creator has created them.
Amen. Wow, this was an excellent talk, and time has flown by with you, Bruce. We've got a very interactive and energetic chat. We could take chat questions and discuss this topic for, until same time tomorrow, but we have hit that 2-hour mark, and I want to respect your time, Bruce. I really appreciate the time that you've given to us here for tonight. For the presentation, truly blew my mind, blowing evidence for design, as I titled it, mind-blowing design, impossible by evolution. Brother. And so I wanted to hand it to you if you had any final words, final thoughts, anything you wanted to leave us with here today. And that includes the skeptics. I'm sure some of what you've said and presented on the limitations of evolution, the incredible evidence for design in the biological world, peacocks to slugs to reptile like iguanas, for example, leaf hoppers. That was a new one to me. Yeah. And that was fascinating. And so anything you want to leave both us non-critics, but also critics with here tonight, Bruce?
Just the acknowledgement that we're all biased. Every human being walking this earth is biased. We're all drawing conclusions based on what we have been taught to believe. Now, I came out of an agnostic, God was irrelevant viewpoint, but there's people that have come out of what I believe to be a distorted Christian viewpoint and ended up being atheists and agnostics. So it goes both ways. But just be looking for the truth. And it's tough because the truth comes with implications. And the belief in God comes with the responsibility of obedience. And as human beings, we don't like that. So realize you're biased and be looking for what is the truth, and be willing to acknowledge that this is just two faiths. You do not, as a believer in evolution, you do not have all the answers, not even close. You have enormous problems. And I'm sure the creation folks don't have all the answers either, but I try to hold to only invoking God in those areas where he specifically said he has been involved. The creation of the universe itself, the creation of life in very different forms, a real factual, actual world restructuring flood. And you leave any of those out, you're going to misinterpret biology. You're going to misinterpret biology. You're going to misinterpret the age of things and the timing of things. Searchforthetruth.net. I have 20 hours of videos with examples after examples after examples. I teach on a layman's level, so I'm sure you're going to be able to pick things apart in little nitpicky scientific things I haven't covered. But realize that I'm trying to just get the concepts out there in front of people that they're not able to hear anywhere else because of such censorship in our education system. And I appreciate anybody who's listening, who's skeptical. Just keep looking for the truth. And God is there. He loves you. Don't ever doubt it. Just because we live in this fallen creation. And I pray for folks who are searching for the truth, that they will find it. And, have a blessed Christmas.
Wow. Amen. Well said. I'm familiar with a lot of your talks and material, Bruce, and you've been a real blessing. Your work has been an incredible blessing. And so I do want to encourage people. I've got your links here. Searchforthetruth.net. You've also got a YouTube channel where you've been uploading clips, if I'm not mistaken.
You can find lots and lots of my stuff, both on the website and the YouTube. I've written 11 books on the scientific evidence for creation, authored and co-authored. Just released a children's series, which is really kind of fun and cool for Christmas. Anyway, check it out. Maybe you'll learn something.
Well, and we really only touched on just a very small slice of the overall material that you covered.
We just scratched the surface. Yep.
Yeah, we didn't even really get into, at all, the evidence for the a young Earth, geologic evidence for the gold.
All the evidence for the young Earth either deals with physics and the methods needed to do radiocarbon, radiometric dating, and so on, or cosmology and the assumptions that go into the Big Bang, or most importantly, because most relevant is what's going on here on Earth. Where do you place this creation in a real biblical worldview of Earth history? Was the worldwide flood a real event here on Earth or not?
That's right.
And there is every bit as much evidence supporting that as supporting the biological end of things.
Amen. The evidence truly is overwhelming. I like to say it's a great time to be a biblical creationist. You made the point, though, and correct me if I'm wrong, Bruce, throughout the presentation and talk, we're dealing with two faiths. We have faith. The evolutionist has faith. But truth matters. Evidence matters. And the way I understand your presentation, Bruce, is that although we have two faiths, our faith, the biblical creation faith, is supported by evidence. I mean, we have all this evidence that's pointing to the existence of God. We're not proving God. Science is about experiments and disproving. I think it was Einstein. It's at least attributed to Einstein, Bruce, where he said, 1,000 observations can be consistent with my model, but all it takes is one experiment that is inconsistent with it that could disprove it.
Well, and that's where I've been going with all this. There's a classic thing called the white swan test, where if your scientific model is all swans are white, you'll never prove it by just finding more and more and more white swans. The only way you're going to know if you're right or not is looking for a black swan, and then you'll know whether you were right. Evolution will never accept or allow a black swan, no matter how definitive it is, because it's a dogma, it's a belief. It's the one area of science where it doesn't operate as a science. Nothing was ever, it would just fold in any evidence or throw out some story or throw out some possibility, and then continue to believe it. But that's faith, that's not science. Yep.
I'm going to borrow that from you, the white swan concept.
Yeah, Dr. Karl Popper. It's clear back in the early 1900s. He was trying to define what is falsibility, and it's really classic. It's called the white swan test. Is what you believe, does it pass the white swan test? In other words, are you looking for something that will falsify your belief or not? Or are you just looking for more white swans that'll help support what you want to believe anyway? And that's the essence of evolution. It will only accept white swans. Like, for instance, could the Big Bang, literally, if you understand it, has to start with nothing. And there have been dozens of books written saying the universe from nothing. because if they start with something, they have to explain where the something came from. So it's the quantum plasma or the metaphysical dot that everything was compressed into or whatever. They just got names for it, but then they'll say, well, it's really nothing. And then all time, space, energy, and matter explosively expanded from it. And it did it at multiple times the speed of light. That's never been proven. And then it slowed down at exactly the right time in order for galaxies and stars to form, which they don't know how that could have happened. So it's just filled with faith and storytelling. Well, the most tested, the most experimented, the most observed law of science that transcends every single discipline of science is that matter and energy can never be created and never be destroyed.
Right.
So we honestly know the universe couldn't have created itself based on science, based on experiments, based on observation. So what do the believers in cosmic evolution do? They just come up with multiverses. That if you have an infinite number of universes, then no matter how impossible something is, it absolutely has to have happened. Well, that's a mathematical concept that you can't observe, test, understand, or believe. So it's unfalsifiable. It's a belief. The black swan is the universe couldn't have made itself.
Right.
They'll just find some other fanciful white swan to hang on to, but it's never testable or provable. So you see what I'm getting at? It's two beliefs, but they won't even admit what they have as a belief. They'll just continue to fold fanciful ideas and storytelling and mathematical assumptions into it as if that proves things.
Right. That's such great. But Bruce, I've seen the multiverse concept in Marvel Comics movies.
Oh, it's everywhere.
So it
is in mainstream science too. It's not just the comic books.
Right.
There are multiple papers and research studies and books that deal with it in mainstream science too. Because our universe is so unimaginably fine-tuned and perfectly designed that it's astronomically impossible in any other way than just assuming infinite universes that it could even exist at all. Anyway, I do have to go. I
thought we were done, and there's just so much that we could elaborate on. So Bruce, God bless you. I appreciate those final words, final thoughts, and additional bonus points. That's what we'll consider the last 5 minutes. So God bless you. To the audience, thank you so much for tuning in. I appreciate all the questions, the feedback, the comments, and of course, the support. Truth matters, evidence matters, and I hope you're as edified here tonight as I was. God bless you all.
I appreciate it, Donnie. You have a blessed Christmas season, as does all of your listeners. There's no animosity here, just a totally disconnected viewpoint of reality. But there is only one reality, so we can't both be right.
Merry Christmas, brother. Well said. God bless you.
All right.